There are some stories I don't necessarily want to say it, but we'll do it anyway. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Before I get into my thoughts, I just want to let you know my thoughts this morning were helped along by the 2008 DVD Rob Bell, The Gods Aren't Angry. If you want it, I own it, and I'd be happy to loan it to you. It's worth watching. So if you have not grown up in the church, if you haven't heard this story over and over again 1,000 times, then you probably weren't shocked and horrified by it. But if by chance this was your first time ever hearing the story, or you weren't raised in a church, this story can be, honestly, this story can be awful. I remember the very first time I ever heard this story. I was sitting in my home church, Berry Center Presbyterian Church. I had to be less than 5 years old, and the preacher got up and read this particular story, and then I remember at the end of the service, because my dad always did it, during the last hymn, he would either put his arm around me, and his hands, were about this big when I was a kid, you know. He would either put his arm around me and put his hand on my shoulder, or he would hold my hand during the last hymn. And I remember that when he did that morning, that was the first time my dad had ever put his hand on me, and I felt uncomfortable. That, well, gosh, if that's what it means to be faithful, would my dad do that to me? Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. What would I do if God asked me to do that? It's stories like this that give outsiders and skeptics all the ammunition they need to bring down the faith. Really, offer your son. Offer your only son whom you love as a way to make your God happy and prove that you're essentially a faithful person. Really? And throughout the Bible and into Christian history, Abraham is held up as the shining example of what it means to be faithful to God. But why? Because he was willing to kill his son? Is that what faith is? What is this story saying about what God is like? Is this a God you can trust? Is this the kind of God you actually would want to follow? And if you actually do want to follow a God like this, what is this story saying about what it means to be faithful to that God? There's a question that in reading and hearing this story, and on preaching on it, really, it changed when I actually became a father to an only son whom I love dearly. There's a question that just kind of gnaws at me about this story. And I think it's a question that can be kind of a gateway into the deeper meaning of this story. So God comes to Abraham and says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you there. This is the very first time that the word love is used in the Bible. Did you know that? Very first time it appears, right here. Love. But the fact that it's talking about love, that's the issue. Because here's the question I started asking when I became the father to an only son. If God recognizes that Abraham loves his son in this way, then how come when Abraham is first told, go and sacrifice your son, how come Abraham doesn't just say, no? Go and sacrifice this son you love. No way. Or at least, why doesn't he put up some sort of resistance? Sacrifice my son? Are you nuts? Are you crazy? I prayed about having this kid for decades and decades and decades. You promised me this kid, remember? And looking up in the stars and all that stuff and great nations and people. Are you crazy? No way. And not only that, why didn't he ask how to do it? Go and sacrifice your son. Remember, this is fairly early on in the story of God's people. By this point, Genesis chapter 22, nobody had done any kind of formal ritual sacrifice at all in the Jewish people. There was no Jewish people yet. There was just Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. So how did he know what to do? But yet God said, go and sacrifice, and he didn't ask why, and he didn't ask how. So why is Abraham not just shocked and horrified by the idea that God would ask him to offer a son that he loved to God? And why does Abraham know how to do it? He instinctively just knows. I think we read these stories today, and Abraham is Father Abraham, right? We got songs for him. He's a folk hero. He's just a Bible story that we tell, and it's in the kids' Bibles, and we do the Father Abraham song. And he's just a guy. He's a character in a story that we hear and that we're told and that we pass on. But we forget that these stories came out of a certain culture, that before Abraham was a folk hero of the faith, Abraham was a human being who really lived and really existed and moved and operated in a culture that was very, very different than the one we live in today. So why is Abraham not shocked by the idea that God would ask him to offer his son? And how could he possibly know how to do it before ever being instructed? Well, in that time, in that culture, the common belief was that the gods demanded the best of what you had in order to make them happy and keep yourself in their favor. Now, if it wasn't raining outside and your crop was suffering, you needed to get the gods to recognize how faithful you were. You had to get them on your side. If you were unable to have children, or you kept having children and those children couldn't breathe when they were born, or so, you had to get the gods on your side. So what was the way to do it? You give them something you love. If that happens to be a lamb, great. If that happens to be a good, healthy young goat, fantastic. Give that to the gods. Show the gods how valuable they are to you by giving something valuable to them. And if you really, really, really wanted to show the gods how much you loved them and how devoted you were, well, then the best way to do that would be to sacrifice your child. Especially if it was an only child. Especially if it was a son in that culture, where having a son meant so much. Well, what better way? And not only was that the best way, but that's what the gods demanded. Give us your best. Show me you love me. And we know that this happened routinely in the ancient world. It happened. If you go further in the Bible, you see it in Psalms and in 2 Kings and in Jeremiah and in Deuteronomy twice, that the other cultures around them were doing this exact thing. So Abraham, a man of his time, knows that this is what it means to worship a god. The gods demand what's most precious to you. So God tells him to sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham just heads out to do it. And he knows how because it's happening around him. That's what it means to follow a god. They demand that you give them what you love most. And up to this point in the story, it fits perfectly with what the gods back then would have looked like in Abraham's day. But then something happens. Something that would have just blown the mind of every person hearing that story in the ancient world. Abraham binds Isaac and places him on the wood and takes out the knife, and God only knows what's going through Abraham's mind, who knows, or Isaac's for that matter. And he's about to pull the knife down and do his son in when a divine voice shouts, "Stop! Stop! Don't lay a hand on the boy. Sacrifice this ram instead." And this is a radical thing that God is doing there. Reading this story 5,000 years later, we miss just how revolutionary this is in its time. God was saying to Abraham, you live in a world where the gods demand that you give them what is most valuable to you, but I'm going to change the entire game. This is what it means to follow me. Not that you provide me with what's best to you, but that I will provide for you. It isn't about what you can do for me to prove your love or how devoted you are. It isn't about keeping score and measuring out whether or not you have my favor today or how much you can do to get a little more of my favor. I will provide. That's what this story is all about. God provides. I mean, why does God do it this way? Why is it? I don't know, but that is the whole point of the story. The story doesn't end by saying, see how great Abraham was. The story doesn't end by saying, 5,000 years from now, you will wonder about this. It ends by saying, on the eternal mountain of the Lord, God will provide. So it changes the whole narrative. It's not what do I have to give, but what has been given to me. God provides. And of course, the story didn't end there. If you go forward, fast forward to the New Testament, you see that the story didn't end with Father Abraham. We know that. Remember, God said, take your son, your only son whom you love. First time in the Bible that the word love was used. You know when the first time the word love is used in the New Testament? It's Matthew chapter 3. It's where Jesus is baptized and he comes out of the water and a voice from heaven says, this is my son, whom I love. That also happens to be the first time the word love is used in Mark and in Luke. This is my son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. And if you go forward to the Gospel of John, the first time the word love appears is here. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but will have everlasting life. That's love. That's how much God loves. This is what God is like. God provides. God gives us what is most precious to him so that we might have life. That's the God you follow. So the question is, how can that change and reorient everything? Because Presbyterians, Reformed tradition people, we practically invented the concept of grace and gratitude. It's not about us. It's not about what we do. It's about what God has done for us. How are you going to live in that gratitude? It changes everything. It means, because I was raised going to all those camps and all those events where you would stand during the worship service and then they would say, come forward, and you'd respond to the altar call, and there is nothing wrong with that. But then I would leave that altar call, and the first time I did something crazy, which was usually on the way back to my seat, when I thought of whatever it was that I thought of about the other person that was walking up to the altar call, they're not going to stick with it, is, oh my gosh, did I walk up? Was it genuine? Did I do it well enough? Did I say the right prayer well enough? It was all about me. It was about measuring up to some standard, which of course you can never, ever, ever measure up to. I was never enough. But in this telling of the story, you are. Not because of you, but because God provides. So what if you in your own life stopped struggling to measure up because you can't, and it's already been done for you? That means you're free. You are free to live. You're free to actually line your life up with Jesus. Not because you're trying to gain anything, but because it's been gained for you already. And what does it mean to live in gratitude in relation to other people? Well, it probably means, just for starters, that the same way you can't pull out the measuring stick and put it up against your own life, you shouldn't do that to anybody else's either. Live in gratitude. If you can realize the grace that God has given you, can you realize that that grace might extend to somebody else too? And that with all their shortcomings and with the crazy things they say and the hurtful things they do, they just might be a child of God like you are. And start to work together. Just fold up that measuring stick, put it in your back pocket. Don't even install the app on your phone. Useless. Because it's God who does the measuring. And God has provided. God is providing, and God will always provide for his people. So live your life from gratitude, giving thanks to God for everything in your life, and giving thanks to God for the people who are in it. Amen.